Joining us today is retired Navy Commander Paul Giarra. He managed the U.S.-Japan alliance for the Office of the Secretary of Defense and helped create the global strategy for the U.S. Navy at the end of the Cold War. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's nice to be here with you, Chris and Matt and Shelley.
So, obviously, there's a lot of military attention right now on everything that's happening with Russia and Ukraine. But I remember last year there was a RAND analysis that said even though the Russia threat is more immediate, long-term, China is the bigger threat. What do you think about that?
As far as that statement goes, I think that's correct. However, I think it's going to become increasingly clear going forward that you can't separate the two. Mm-hmm. It's not as if you have a different situation going on in Europe that has no connections to, relevance to, and importance for things going on in Asia with China. The $64,000 question is to what extent Putin and Xi have already been colluding and to what lengths they'll go in the future. So that's probably the single greatest geopolitical question right now.
Yeah, so it's like a little bit of a war in Europe, a little bit of a war in China, kind of like, a world war, kind of.
Kind of, right.
Kind of. But so this is very interesting. Like, there is the possibility, like warfare in Europe with Russia, that's going to be a very different theater than a hypothetical war in the Indo-Pacific, which would largely be a naval conflict, I'd imagine. How can the U.S. manage these two very different theaters of war?
I wouldn't highlight the differences quite so much. First, I think that the Navy is relevant to both. I think the Navy, when operated properly, unlike today, is global and it's essentially controlled. But I think that whatever happens in the Asia Pacific is going to have a lot of land going on, as they say. Because after all, if you take the point that we're back in a Cold War, that American grand strategy is to prevent the domination of Eurasia by a single antithetical power or coalition, eventually it's about land. And in the Asia Pacific, there's maritime geography that is the islands, the littorals, the capes, the headlands, and so on, that are going to have to be controlled. This is nothing new. It's a page from the past. I don't think our land element, the Marines and the Army, have quite woken up to what that is going to be. The Marines are heading off in a direction that I think is misguided because I don't think they're taking into account the resistance and the response they're going to get from China in those littorals.
Now, you said you think the way the Navy is managed today is not good, and you're also talking about problems with the Marines. What are these problems, and what would need to change?
I attended the confirmation hearings in the Senate Armed Services Committee for Admiral Kelso when he, in 1990, I think it was, when he was getting ready to step up to be the Chief of Naval Operations. And John McCain tossed him a softball pitch. It was, do we need a maritime strategy? Now, mind you, I was in the Navy Maritime Strategy Office at the time, so I put on my best bib and tucker and went over to Capitol Hill. The senator asked the admiral, do we need a maritime strategy? And essentially, the admiral said, no. So since then, for all intents and purposes, despite numbers of attempts, the Navy hasn't had a maritime strategy. It's tried to play catch up during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq with the other services. It's provided offshore air power, but never challenged in any way. It's gotten used to that. And almost stubbornly, the subsequent CNOs have insisted that somehow the Goldwater-Nichols legislation has basically told them they're not in charge of strategy anymore. Don't worry about it. That's somebody else's job. Well, go ahead.
I mean, one reason that they might not have a strategy is they don't have a clear goal. Would that be correct?
You can't separate out strategies from goals.
Right. So I mean, what's the goal that we have or should have in the region, and how does that intersect with what our strategy ought to be?
Maritime power is the greatest single determinant of geopolitics. If you start from that proposition and work forward, you realize that everything that happens ashore or at sea is going to depend upon the Navy. Now, I'm a navalist, so, I can be criticized for being single-minded about this. But even the Duke of Wellington, after the Napoleonic Wars were finished, said something to the effect of, yeah, I owe it all to the Royal Navy, because without which I couldn't have done what I did in Portugal, Spain, and eventually at Waterloo.
Right, but I mean, this is the 21st century, and we have airplanes and such means of trains and other means of transportation. So why is maritime power still so important?
I mean, you launch a lot of those planes off of a ship.
Because everything moves, almost everything moves by sea. That's the first thing. And a great element of this is to first and foremost dominate the trade routes. So number one, you can use them for trade. And number two, you can deny their use to your enemy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the maritime approaches to Eurasia determine the ability to focus from the outside military, economic, and political power on Eurasia. If you can't get there, you can't do anything about it. So those are two of the reasons why it's still relevant. Let me frame this in a slightly different way. There are some things that change. Air power is one of them. A century ago, air power was almost hardly thought of. It took off, pun intended, during the First World War in its military uses, and then commercially as well subsequently. But other things don't, and one of the things that doesn't is this central importance of maritime power. Now, I'm not here to tell you that the Navy can do this by itself, despite the fact that, as we joke, the Navy has its own Army and Air Force. I don't mean to say that at all, but maritime power is the shadow of maritime power is American diplomacy, and the credence in the minds of allies and enemies starts with where our Navy is and what our Navy can do. So this doesn't have to be a conversation about the Navy, but I think it's a pretty good starting point for what's happening and what might happen and also what should happen.
Well, I'm curious because you shaped a lot of U.S. naval strategy for years, but do you think like your advice is being followed? It doesn't seem like there is as much focus on the Indo-Pacific or the prominence of the Navy in U.S. military power.
I disagree with you on the first supposition that there's no focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Sorry, I meant over the past couple of decades. That has changed?
Yes, I think so. I think that over time, but too little too late in my view, attention in the Pentagon broadly and in the Navy specifically has shifted to the Asia-Pacific first and now the so-called Indo-Pacific. And that's okay rhetorically, and it's good that, I presume, because I certainly don't have any insight into this, that naval planners are thinking about that, and they're thinking about the Chinese Navy and so on. But there's, in history, including our own, there's virtually no example of the naval buildup that we're seeing now with the PLA Navy. And we can't keep our ships painted.
Really?
Really. So there's been no congruent response. So rhetorically, the focus on the Indo-Pacific, that's all well and good. But in reality, certainly in terms of force structure, and this is an important point, in terms of stated maritime strategy. Now, whatever exists behind the closed doors, that's one thing. My view is, and always has been, that it needs to be public. It needs to be publicized, that we need to understand it here so that we can decide on whether or not to fund the Navy. But Beijing and Tokyo and Delhi and Moscow and Brussels need to understand also. And there's been no bump up. So right now, the Navy is concentrated on building the new strategic missile submarine, the Columbia class. That's important. That's necessary. But when it comes time, and this happens over and over again, this has been going on for decades, unlike earlier periods in our history, when the Congress asks the Navy what it wants and needs, it doesn't tell them.
Why is that?
I think part of it, well, first of all, I don't know. I mean, the honest answer, Shelley, is it's inexplainable. Because any right-minded military officer, Navy or otherwise, should be able to say, at the drop of a hat, entering the elevator, well, sir, I think what we need is X, Y, and Z. Now, I don't think that everybody should have to make that up. I think that elevator speech and the briefings and the visits to the country and the visits to Capitol Hill should be carefully and thoughtfully orchestrated centrally. But as I said, because of the, in my view, misinterpretation of Goldwater-Nichols, the Navy has stopped doing that.
Can you explain Goldwater-Nichols to us?
So after some of the late Cold War military interventions, if you remember Grenada, there were officers who were relegated to making credit card phone calls back to the Pentagon to pass information, things like that. So it was pretty clear to everybody who was watching that the military hadn't gotten together so that they could talk to one another. And by the way, that's not necessarily well resolved. But so at that point, the Congress decided, and what the Congress decides pretty much goes, that there needed to be a new organizational scheme for the U.S. military, with an emphasis on what's called jointness, with ostensibly forcing the different services to operate together from the same sheet of music, so to speak.